Hello, good people. When I was 16 or 17 years old, my high school English class had a unit on modernism. It was a lot about different artists of the period, introducing us to stream of thoughts, writing primarily through reading an excellent book called Mrs. Dalloway by Virginia Woolf that I definitely recommend. But one part of it too, just to show us how kind of wacky the writers at that time could get. My teacher, who was an excellent teacher, had us do an exercise where we read the first page of a book called Finnegan's Wake, or at least attempted to read it. It did not go over so well. It really shocked and enraged the class, pretty much. But my teacher said something interesting when talking about its author, that um, the guy who wrote Finnegan's Wake also wrote what is both one of the hardest books ever, yet at the same time, if you were to survey all the English professors of the world, it would probably be the consensus for greatest book ever. And that is Ulysses by James Joyce, which after a couple months of reading, I have finally finished across two books. Got a really big one too. This is the illustrated version. Let me see if I can find a good image. Here we are on the way to Patty Dignam's funeral, um, along with some YouTube watching, so I could better understand what was going on. At the time, I had been doing next to no independent reading. That there was something about that challenge of the best book of all time being so hard that really got me back into it. Slowly but surely, it was a struggle for me then to read outside of school 5 books in a year. That's really, I'm hoping to do a end of the year review of every book I read in 2026, and I'm already well over 5. We'll see how high I get at the end of the year, but it really reignited my desire to read that I had as a child, reading the Phantom Toll Booth and the stories of Roald Dahl and everything like that. Um, and it's led me to now where I have a YouTube channel where like half of my videos are about books and writing, um, and the books are getting mentioned in even the videos that aren't directly about them. But yeah, it was a long journey. I read probably 70 books between then and beginning Ulysses, and mainly because I was not ready at all. There's a lot of talk in going through this experience of what one needs to do to prepare. I think more importantly, I was just trying to become good at reading, which is kind of an odd thing to be good at because it depends so much on what you're reading if you're good at reading it. But this doing this whole experience. By the way, I'm trying to setting up this video as not a review of the book. There are many, many much more qualified people than me. Um, I'd like to set this up as more of a review of the experience of reading the book as a normal person, which normal enough. Um, so, spoilers, overall, I think it was a really good experience that I am better to have done, which a lot of people assume, but I also enjoyed doing it, which is a bit more contested, I'd say. But back to the preparation, there are two books that I feel like are considered kind of mandatory before reading this book, and both for good reason. The first would be the Odyssey, which Ulysses shadows. A lot of people will correct you if you call it a remake or a retelling, because it's too technically loose, and Joyce didn't intend that. And later in this video, I'm going to refer to the different chapters. Chapters named after episodes of the Odyssey, such as Cyclops and Ithaca, and that's not something that Joyce intended. That was added by, I believe, editors. And then the other obvious one that people say you should be familiar with is Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, also by James Joyce. This Ulysses is technically a sequel. This is a book that follows Joyce's self-insert character, as many have called him, Stephen Dedalus, about his schooling and his shift of wanting to become a poet. I read the Odyssey in high school and enjoyed it, not only because there was killing people and action in it, but because it was an easier read. It was really cool to be reading this book as the Christopher Nolan Odyssey movie came out. I'm very jealous of kids that are in high school now because they get to watch that version instead of the one from the 60s that my class watched. It was also really fun to, have this story, although much more subversive in how it tells the Odyssey. It still really refreshed me on the Odyssey for the movie, and vice versa. I was about halfway through when I went and watched the Nolan movie. As for Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man, I read that I started it in 2025, finished it at the end of 2026. It made me nervous because I did not like it, and I like pretty much almost every book that I read. It wasn't my first experience with Joyce. I also have this book, Dubliners, which is his book of short stories. It includes The Dead, which is very popularly considered not only to be Joyce's best short story, but one of, if not the best short stories of all time. There's a quote in the movie The French Dispatch, directed by Wes Anderson, talking about figuring out an artist, if an experimental artist is worth their brass, by having them draw something simple and directly, such as a sparrow. And the artist character proves his mettle that despite being a mainly abstract expressionist, that he can draw a damn good sparrow very quickly. The Dead is Joyce's Sparrow. It is nowhere near as experimental as his later works, but it is really just some of the finest writing ever. Cannot recommend it enough. It's longer than most short stories, but it is a short story. You should read it. So anyway, that was my first experience actually reading a whole Joyce story. I thought it was amazing. I think about it probably once a week. Incredible story. And then I go into Portrait of the Artist, and I don't really like it. I kind of thought it was a bit dreary, and I didn't really connect with Stephen Dedalus much. There were some highlights. People talk about the Hellfire sermon in it, as well as his epiphany on the beach, and I did like those. But I mean, that's a lot of the rest of the book I kind of just felt was a bit repetitive and just not very entertaining at all, and it made me very reluctant to go and do this goal I had for a very long time of reading this so-called best book ever, because I didn't really like Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. With The Dead, which is one of the stories I propose, as well as just as much of Dubliners as you'd like to do, it's great. I'd like to propose Shakespeare's Hamlet, as a prerequisite, read, watch, or listen. And another lighter yet still pretty out there read. For example, right here I have Mark Z. Danielowski's House of Leaves, which is a relatively popular book, especially here on YouTube. Um, I read that in 2024 in about a month, which is probably one of my like fastest per page reads because I think it's like 800 pages, but it really flies. It's a super entertaining read, primarily with its main story, the Navidson record, which is just super entertaining. Probably the best horror I've ever seen on the page, although I haven't done much, to be fair. Um, and it's also just really out there with the amount of footnotes, the its use of form, and just the nature of the book's multiple fictionalized authors and how they interact with each other is nuts. It's a very multi-dimensional book, if there ever was a word. So I would say do something like that. That's a challenge, but it is the half marathon to the marathon that is Ulysses. And then if you want to keep extrapolating that, then Finnegan's Wake is one of those ultra marathons that David Goggins does. I don't know if I'll ever have that in me as a reader, although it's after Ulysses, I kind of want to give it a shot. So I guess now I can give overall thoughts on the book, and then I'll go more deep into my experience chapter by chapter after that. Overall, yeah, this actually is one of the best books of all time. I somehow had my expectations blown away. I don't think it's fair to go into anything thinking it's going to be the best ever. I didn't think it was going to be that good, but like I was like, okay, this better be good if I'm dedicating an entire summer, give or take, to this being my only physical book that I'm reading. And it blew me away. I thought this was an amazing book. I read it mainly among the popular ones. You hear the story of usurpation and a father and son finding each other. The popular analyses. I like what really stuck with me is I think what tied it together is it being a story of crises of faith. That immediately is putting your face in the first couple pages with Stephen and his losing his faith in the face of his mother's death. And then you meet Bloom, who is struggling primarily with his his faith in himself, brought on so much by grief and anti-Semitism then of course at the end you have Molly, who has not been faithful to him, and I think it's also Joyce himself grappling with his faith in his country. So that was my, like, I guess I don't know if you can even call that a hot take, but that was like the main central theme I got out of it. But overall, just more into what I thought. Leopold Bloom, what a character, one of the finest ever. The whole thing wouldn't work without him. I love Bloom. He is hilarious. He is mostly lovable. He's deeply tragic. He is just incredibly real. It feels like I know him. And that's so impressive when half of the chapters you see him in are so difficult to read, like Oxen of the Sun and Cyclops. Cyclops is probably the best example where, the book is physically forcing you to work so hard to follow it, and yet still this character, he's so kind and personable that he just radiates out of it. And that despite what shortcomings I ever had in terms of my attention span and as a reader, Bloom was the anchor that kept me going, because you just get so tight with him. It was amazing. I should say, spoilers. This is not really the type of book that can be spoiled. There's the plot is very simple. Everyone already knows what happens in the Odyssey. It's of course a very different setting and different characters, but it's over 100 years old, and it's the only thing that will really surprise you is the style itself. So there's the late spoiler warning. That's my bad. Before I get into my chapter by chapter thoughts, I also want to shout out Chris Rich and his series Reading Ulysses for Fun on YouTube. He is my analysis guy that I used. What drew him to me over the more academic ones was honestly, counterintuitively, how anti-pathos he was about the whole thing. The main two things he said is that he had read Ulysses multiple times and checked out these different academic readings of it. But really what got me was that he said it was his favorite book of all time. I was reading this for fun, so I think the best way to do that is to learn it from somebody who really loves it. All my best teachers I ever had were people who really loved teaching and were passionate about their experience. He does a video anywhere from 15 to 45 minutes for each chapter, which is a lot, but he doesn't waste the time. The guy himself, Chris, is awesome. He makes it such a happy story. He does a lot of good details to look for before you go in and read the chapter. He's hilarious. He gets his Irish whiskey and he cheers you at the end of the video. He loves the book so much, and they're old videos. I don't think he replies to the comments anymore, but he had a great rapport going with the commenters 8 years ago when he was making these videos. Cannot recommend it enough. But there's also annotated copies on the internet along with college lectures on YouTube. I wouldn't recommend buying anything, I guess. I mean, this is already going to take a lot of purchasing of books. Also with the illustrated version that I have, you probably don't need that. I'm glad I had it. It was a gift, which was really thoughtful, and it's hilarious. I guess preparing for it, I didn't understand what type of confusing it was going to be, so I thought that having images drawn in would really help me. That's not exactly the issue. And then one overall thought before we get into the chapter by chapter is I loved reading this because it made me remember why I like meditating so much. The best I've ever gotten at meditating was about a year ago, a little longer now, where I was living somewhere that had a really good setup to do sensory deprivation at home, if that makes sense. And I was using it to kind of start scratching the surface of thoughtlessness and the sensation that is commonly known as the third eye. And it was really cool. And you're probably at this point saying, what the hell does this have to do with this Irish book from 1922? And how I would answer that is Joyce was so methodical behind all of the tricks and games he played that, especially, I think, early on, if you look at a chapter like Proteus, that he is hiding these like incredibly vivid details behind it. So, you're working really hard to maintaining the necessary focus and rigor to get that crystal clear mental image in your head, and it is so rewarding. Like, there are multiple chapters where I would go out of it and just like my brain felt like it was buzzing, like it was really a workout. So that was an incredible sensation and arguably my favorite part of the book. But yeah, on to the chapters. I'll start with my favorites, then I'll do the least favorites, which are still good. I don't think there's a bad chapter to this book, but I'm very much going to play favorites like a bad parent here. Chapter 3, Proteus, is the last Stephen chapter before it goes into the main protagonist being Bloom. It's very infamous as the chapter that makes a lot of people stop reading Ulysses because it's a bit of a difficulty spike and a bit more immersed into the head of a character. The first two chapters, to me at least, felt like a slightly better version of Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. Proteus is when it really becomes Ulysses to me, and it is awesome. I love beaches too. There's a lot of beach in that chapter. It makes me kind of sound like a shallow reader when I say, "Oh, I like it was at the beach." But like back to the mental images, like being able to go through that chapter really slowly and doing everything I could in my head to conjure up the image of Stephen walking around a strand, and especially hearing what he hears as he's closing his eyes for much of that chapter is great. Moving on a little bit, I like all the early Bloom stuff, but then the next moment for me where I was like, wow, this book is towards the middle of the book with Wandering Rocks. That one, since this all started with Virginia Woolf in school, really reminded me of some of the quick successions of POV character changes you would see in Mrs. Dalloway when they're walking in the streets in London. But I liked this even better. It was amazing how Joyce really starts trolling you, I think. It's there, but like it gets pretty obvious in this one how there's another character named Bloom who's like a dentist and a real priest and a fake priest, and the note that you think it's supposed to be a note from earlier, but it's actually a completely different identical note that's coming down the river. And like I that's one thing I wish we would see more. Like there's a lot of really shallow analysis takes that you see on the internet, especially when you get a movie like The Odyssey or Obsession from this year that bring out a lot of people just Googling ending explained, and then they're getting it explained by more people who also didn't really get the spirit of the story, and it's like, and it gives them the confidence to like act like they know it. It's awesome to mislead to that level, because then it makes me feel like I can only really trust myself and my gut and just having to go into that maze of the Wandering Rocks. Moving onward a bit more towards the end of the second act, the Cyclops chapter. It's hilarious. That was the first one where I really noticed Joyce's obsession with lists. I could totally see you getting sick of his lists, but I thought it was hilarious. I think that's the one where he talks about like the 11 worst books of all time, and it really just made me laugh. Huge fan of the Cyclops chapter, and it's also, you get some incredible Leopold Bloom moments. I should mention too, I really like the other two protagonists, Stephen, despite not liking him so much in Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. I immediately loved Stephen in this, And Molly Bloom is awesome as well. We'll get to her, I guess. Um, and then not too long after Cyclops as a big highlight, you get Cersei, which is such an incredible chapter. Another famous one. It's the one that is in the form of a play, and it's, I believe, over 100 pages long. I dedicated, I think, over a week to reading it, just this one chapter, and I loved it. Once again, hilarious, psychedelic. It's you get some great Stephen and Bloom. You get maybe the best ending to a chapter ever. I don't, I know I said spoiler alert, but I'm actually just gonna leave that for the reader. If really, and if you get spoiled by your guide, you get spoiled by your guide. But if there's one thing I wish that I like went into completely blind, it was probably the absolute end of Cersei. And then I also loved the Ithaca chapter. Once again, odd form. I really liked it. It's very stuffy and formal prose over just the most like informal, like tender and like wholesome scene ever, and it worked really well for me because why I think this book is so great. If I had to say one thing, it's because the warmth of the characters bleeds through the maze that is the form of it, and it just creates something really special. And that's really where you get the payoff of Bloom blooming and becoming quite possibly the best character ever. I finished this book about 48 hours ago, so I might be a little high on Bloom, but I honestly don't think so. I really think I am forever going to consider him one of, if not the best characters ever. I don't think that's really a hot take in the sphere of literature. He is amazing. And that's the chapter where Bloom blooms and really overcomes his grief. And it's just beautiful. And then finally, another famous chapter, the final chapter, Penelope. That one surprised me with final chapter. I kind of thought I was going to blow through everything. It was hard for me to do Penelope. One chapter that's only 8 sentences, and it was crazy, but it's incredible how you get a little bit of Molly in chapter 4, and then she's not heard from, only mentioned for the rest of the book over Bloom's Day, and then you really get one chapter in her head and you feel like you know her. That's what seems like the real goal of modernist literature is that intimacy of thought, of being inside somebody's head, and the pure, unadulterated stream of consciousness that has been teased but not fully delivered until that point completely lives up to the hype. Once again, the last page or so it's just so beautiful. Really, going back to the Sparrow, this guy, he could do a lot. This James Joyce guy, he had a lot of crazy abstract tricks to his writing, but you have to remember he has one of the best fastball, one of some of the purest fundamentals of any writer ever, and he can just use traditional language to just melt your heart, and it's something to be seen. So I guess now it's really more for my... Oh, wait. Before I go into the review, least favorite chapters. Oxen of the Sun. That was the only time I felt like he was going too advanced for me, where it was like, okay, dude, I don't really know what's going on. I'm still, even after watching analysis, kind of confused. It might just be this time in the setting that Bloom's visiting a minor acquaintance at the hospital at night, who's been in labor for 3 days, and then there's all the doctors are like treating it like a party and drinking directly there, and Steven just kind of showed up. And then, yeah, not only is it kind of an odd circumstances, but it is by far the hardest chapter to read, and I do feel like I lost some immersion there. Nausicaa, which is, I think, right before. Yeah, it's right before. I also was not that crazy about. I think it's important to talk about Bloom's recovery, both physically and mentally, and kind of showing the reader he still did have a long way to go. I think that maybe could have been executed better. The Nausicaa chapter of the Odyssey is also just super weird, and I can see why Nolan didn't put it in the movie like at all. So that might be part of it. Still some great moments. It's part of it's on the beach, as we've established. I like that. And then there's Eumaeus, which is another chapter where, especially because it's a Bloom and Steven chapter, which was my favorite part overall of the book when they're together because of Circe and Ithaca. The chapter right between them being written in this purposefully bad way is crazy to me. Like, I know Joyce liked to satirize and parody and change styles, especially, criticize the times, and I do appreciate that. Like, the Aeolus chapter, I thought was a much better way to do that than him just writing bad on purpose for what should have been one of the most pivotal points of the story. So yeah, not a big fan of that one, which is a shame because he could have just that's one where less is more. And honestly, that should have been the story of this whole book, but he was just so masterful and created great characters that I was willing to put up with so much difficult language and shifts in style. So, if you're a regular person, and you don't have to read Ulysses for a class or for any type of research, do I recommend it? I do. I think, you should be a very well-read person, and you should have read those prerequisites I talked about. You could honestly get away with not doing Portrait of the Artist as a Young Man. I don't know if that's a hot take. You figure out who Steven is pretty quickly. You don't need another book for that. It's a challenge. You got to be cool with not really reading anything else for a while. I personally only do one paper book at a time, and then I do one audiobook. So I sacrificed one summer of reading anything else for something that is not exactly a beach read. But it's a fun time. That's especially if you're watching the Chris Rich reading Ulysses for fun, like I was. It is a fun book. That it also happens to be rightfully so called one of the greatest books ever. It's really that good. And not as hard as people say. I know I was talking about Oxen of the Sun and that, succeeding in doing what Joyce wanted to make it do, of having the reader experience physical stomach pains. It was probably the closest a chapter's ever made to me, like, pulling my hair out. Like, it really was just constant rereading. It took overall this book, probably longest time to read a page per page, like, of anything I'll maybe ever do. It gets ridiculous at points. I'm not really helping my case there, but it's not as hard as I thought it was gonna be. I caught in earlier. I fashioned this to of the marathon, and it's not reading will never produce anything that hard, really. It's the marathon's way harder. It's just one of the harder books, but books at the end of the day are entertainment. And, people can get all scholarly all they want, but James Joyce wrote a comedy here. This is a comedy, first and foremost. And it's funny, and it's full of these beautiful and loving images that I think I'd like to see more regular people, time permitting, go ahead and read. Please read the stories on my Substack. Thank you.